to be a conservative racial minority is probably the most unpopular position you could be in on a college campus today. But I imagine, certainly 2016 onward, Neetu and I are in like the unique position that I find quite funny of, on the one hand, being pulled into this DEI bucket as, quote, brown Indian women. At the same time, Ralph, you brought up SFFA in the admissions context, we are penalized for being Indians, for being Asians. And
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the City Journal podcast. My name is Rafael Mangual, and I'm so happy to be your host today. I am joined by my two brilliant colleagues. We have Neetu Arnold and Renu Mukherjee. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Hi. Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing wonderfully. So excited that you guys are joining us because for those of you who are watching and don't know, Neetu and Renu do amazing work on higher education specifically. And I wanted to bring you guys on today because I really wanted to talk about the fact that City Journal did something kind of crazy. We released our own college rankings. So we're now competing with U.S. News and World Reports and Princeton Review and all of these other great institutions. And you guys were very intimately involved in that project. And so I wanted to bring you on just to talk a little bit about those rankings, why we did them, in the broader state of higher education today. So why don't you need to start just by telling us a little bit about the rankings themselves, what makes them notable, what makes them different from some of the stuff that's already out there?
I think it's great that City Journal released its own rankings because, we've seen time and time again in polls that there's declining trust in higher education, and those concerns often fall along two lines, costs and classroom content. Traditional college rankings are able to capture the costs, but they're not measuring whether students are getting a good education. And that's where the City Journal College Rankings is filling that gap. We're looking at issues like the free speech environment, curricular rigor, meritocracy on campus. And I think all those variables are important to give us a fuller picture.
Yeah, Renu, when I was sort of reading the release of the City Journal rankings, one of the sentences that really jumped out at me in John Saylor's write-up of it was that there was a mismatch between reputation and reality. So many of the college ranking systems that we see consistently have, the same handful of schools ranked in their top 10. And we just kind of accept as a society that this is, the educational elite. But in reality, the experience on the ground in a lot of those institutions doesn't quite fit with that narrative. And so just talk to me a little bit about, sort of what exactly is different, because I think a lot of people will be surprised when they see the top 10 of our rankings, right? These rankings are led by the University of Florida, not Harvard, not Yale, not Cornell or Stanford, but the University of Florida. And so, I just think that's really interesting for people to learn a little bit more about.
well, Ralph, like to your point, families can now evaluate what they care more about, the so-called prestigious reputation of institutions or the actual education and experience that their children are going to get when attending a college or a university, which is why, University of Florida is number one because City Journal's ranking system prioritizes a environment that's open to all sorts of student speech, that's open to all sort of political and other forms of organization, that's also, outside of education, simply fun. We forget that so much of the quintessential American college experience is, shockingly not related to academics, but also just what it feels like to be on campus. Is there Greek life? Are students constantly being, bombarded by left-wing activism on their campuses? These are all things that the City Journal rankings take into account in different ways. And so when families consult them, they're really going to get a feel for what it's going to be like to be on the University of Florida's campus, for example, which, like you said, is number one in our ranking system, as opposed to being on Harvard's campus, which, according to U.S. News and World Report, has not left the top 3 of best colleges in America for years and years, but is in the 30s in City Journal's ranking list. And so it's kind of, families will finally be able to care more about what it actually feels like to be on one of America's college campuses.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about just what that feeling is, right? Because I mean, I was in college a very long time ago, so my memories are somewhat faded. But you know, I think one of the things that's sort of a consistent issue of concern for a lot of people who I speak to who are sort of just out of undergraduate institutions or are still in an undergraduate institution. I mean, the number one issue that they sort of raise when I ask them about their experiences is that they feel like they are just outnumbered in every aspect of campus life with respect to, their leanings. Obviously, I interact with a lot of conservative and libertarian students. They don't feel like they have a home in the places where they go to school. In fact, a lot of them go to school sort of understanding that they have sacrificed any real sense of community or belonging because they are chasing that sort of prestige angle, knowing that they are going to be in a very, very small minority as people who do not sort of buy into kind of liberal orthodoxy. And I think a little bit about my experience as an undergrad. It's a bit different. I was not particularly engaged until about halfway through my undergraduate studies, and by that point, by virtue of probably some somewhat toxic personality traits, I didn't really care very much about being in the minority. I'm a pugilist at heart, and so I was perfectly happy to have it out in my classrooms. But when you see some of these sort of faculty ratios in terms of conservatives to liberals, or even sort of moderates to liberals, what you tend to see is that these educational institutions have essentially been captured by the far left, and that speaks to what the experience is going to be like. And so I wonder if you guys can just talk a little bit about sort of what it was like for you all, given that you went to college a lot more recently than I did.
Well, Ralph, I share some of your experiences. When I started college, I wasn't really involved in politics. I didn't really pay attention to politics. I always saw it as just a bunch of people yelling at each other. And maybe to a certain extent, that might be true today too. But I wasn't aware of the costs going in that even people who are conservative or libertarians are aware of. And so as I was developing my views on college, and I went to Cornell University, which is ranked 61 in our rankings. Um, I didn't know what the costs would be until I developed my views, and I quickly learned that uh, different perspectives were not welcome. This was especially bad when I was a resident advisor. I think that particular part of college is very ideologically captured, and we would have these training sessions where we would read the new Jim Crow. I believe that's Michelle Alexander, but then we wouldn't read a Thomas Sowell, and so I just felt like I wasn't getting all sorts of perspectives. Um, one thing that I've learned when I speak to college students today is that there's a lot of social pressure to conform. And that's why I think it's important to have pluralism among the student body, which is something that our rankings capture.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely a ton of social pressure that comes with, being a conservative on an elite college campus in America today, right? Where you are just outnumbered 10, 15, maybe even 100 to 1. But one of the other problems that arises, I think, when you sort of have a lack of pluralism on a campus is that it really undermines the educational pursuit in the eyes of the students themselves. I just think about, sort of my own experience. When I kind of discovered the new right and, thinkers like Thomas Sowell, who you mentioned, who I discovered through watching old episodes of William F. Buckley's Firing Line, which, I hadn't known existed, and came across all of these thinkers that I found fascinating. I found their work, thoughtful and reflective of a really deep expertise that deserved a hearing in the classrooms that I was paying money to be in. And I realized that I was getting a better education outside of my university lecture halls than I was ever getting inside. And it kind of, it put a real chip on my shoulder. It made me feel like the entire experience was really just performative. Like all I was doing was just pursuing, a piece of paper that would allow me to take the next step in life, as opposed to actually engaging in a true educational experience. And, I think that a lot of students likely feel that way. It's hard to really respect the process when you realize that the process is sort of rigged, in the sense that it, basically expels an entire universe of thought that, is absolutely deserving of a hearing. And I need to, I mean, I know you've just given so much deep thought to these issues, through the work that you've done, not just here at the Manhattan Institute, but also as a PhD student. I don't know. Do you think there's something to that?
Totally. I think that there's so much to learn outside of the classroom, particularly like you say, there's we're listening to Firing Line nowadays. I know, for example, we talk about how Ben Shapiro's podcast, for example, has been a gateway for, many now young conservatives, particularly young men who perhaps are not getting exposed to a diversity of ideological perspectives on their college campuses. Of course, this is what Charlie Kirk's entire project with Turning Point was, exposing students to different viewpoints. I will say, though, at the same time, I had a bit of a different experience in undergrad than both of you guys, simply because, well, one, I arrived at college. I went to Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, very much a leftist. I attended a New England preparatory high school, which was very much left wing and was exposed to all sorts of views that, are sort of the banner of the Democratic Party today, such as transgenderism, racial preferences, etc. And I was exposed to one professor who only told me after I graduated that he was very much a conservative, had done his PhD in political science at Claremont McKenna, and it was through taking his courses and going to his office hours that I was exposed to City Journal for the first time,
Wow.
to Heather McDonald, to your work, Ralph, to Thomas Sowell, to different Supreme Court opinions written by Justice Scalia. And he was a mentor to me throughout the entirety of my undergrad experience and inspired me and helped me apply to get a PhD in political science. And so, these schools are very much, riddled with leftist professors. Our colleague John Seiler writes about the scholar activist pipeline.
Yeah.
But something that our rankings prioritize is, having faculty on campus that could be this sort of outlet for conservative students, for moderate students that could provide a different perspective. And so I think, like you say, there's a lot to be learned outside of the classroom, but at the same time, our rankings prioritize having different individuals on campus that can also provide that alternative perspective and education.
I absolutely love that story, and I wish I had one of my own. But, I mean, to the when I became aware of the markers of the sort of ideological, um, camp that my professors were in, if my experience was that if I showed myself to be on the other side, it was quickly written off or singled out as a combatant, right? And oftentimes that was unpleasant, but that wasn't always the case. I think back to my first year of law school. I went to DePaul University in Chicago, and my constitutional law professor later became the Solicitor General of Illinois, a guy named David Franklin. Super brilliant, clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. But, very much on the progressive left. And I think a day or two in, somehow I got outed as a Federalist Society guy within the class. And so, I would just get picked on for that, entire class, right? In law school, a lot of professors will cold call, and there's a whole world of commentary about how terrifying that experience is. I always enjoyed it. But, if another student was asked, to evaluate an argument and an opinion, and they gave the kind of progressive line, it inevitably was followed by, and Mr. Mangual might say, and Mr. Mangual, so I kind of went to that class sort of appreciating that I was going to get called out, in part because it made me engage with the work much more closely than I might otherwise have if I didn't feel like I was under that kind of pressure. Um, you know, but at the same time, there wasn't this, sort of friendly effort to bring me in. And I think part of that just has to do with the fact that like progressives don't really they don't identify with that, right? I think
Mhm.
when a conservative professor who is outnumbered sees a student with promise, who might be on the margins or who might be persuadable, or who at least might be open to engaging with some other ideas, they have, I think, an incentive to cultivate that in a way that progressive professors maybe don't because they just, they feel like they've already won. I don't know. What do you think, Need to?
Think there's an incentive for them to change as of right now only because or to even recognize that viewpoint diversity on campus is a problem because it doesn't necessarily affect them and they would have to go out of their way to make that a priority. Now, one thing I would argue is that I think all professors should care about that issue right now because I think the declining public trust is a problem. If people don't trust your universities, they're not going to trust the information that's coming out of them, the what you're teaching to students. And I still think universities have a place in our society to educate our citizens and to expect better. So I I think they should care, but I don't think there's an incentive to them. And again, I think that's why it's important to show people what campuses are doing a good job, what are the model campuses, and hopefully our rankings can be a way for other universities to expect better, to do better and to improve themselves.
No, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, and just going back to the rankings for a minute, I mean, one of the issues that sort of consistently arises in these debates about the state of higher education in America is the question of meritocracy, right? I mean, to what extent does that exist? And here we are, about a year out from, an incredibly momentous moment at the U.S. Supreme Court and the SFFA case, which, found as unconstitutional and violative of the Civil Rights Act, a lot of the sort of preferential admissions programs that had been explicitly based on race for so many decades, including programs that had been upheld by the Supreme Court in prior years. And yet here we three are, three brown think tank scholars who went through the higher education system. And I just, I'm curious as to what your experiences were with the sort of DEI apparatus and idea. I mean, for my part, I just kind of rejected it. I mentioned this on an earlier episode of the podcast about a week ago. I mean, for me, I just could not accept this idea that by virtue of my race and ethnicity, I was automatically considered someone who needed assistance. I just rejected that framework out of a sense of personal pride. But for a lot of people, they just seemed to really kind of embrace this idea, and it always came across to me as like somewhat performative. Like I remember there was a guy I went to college with, and we actually took the LSAT together. We were in the same room, and I recognized him. And about 9 months or so later, he had posted on Facebook that, he was so proud to be admitted to law school as a young Hispanic man. And I just remember thinking, like, what does the fact that you're Hispanic have anything to do with it? I feel like, of course you're getting admitted to law school. You did well on the LSAT. Like, why can't we just leave it at that? Why does it have to be, why do we need this sort of special status attached to such a superficial aspect of who we are that we had no control over? But the pull of that sort of apparatus, that framework, that sort of ideological component, is so strong and so intoxicating for a lot of people. And I suspect that some of our listeners are wondering how the hell you all resisted it.
I think that to be a conservative racial minority is probably the most unpopular position you could be in on a
Yeah.
college campus today, but I imagine, certainly 2016 onward. Neetu and I are in like the unique position that I find quite funny of, on the one hand, being pulled into this DEI bucket as, quote, brown Indian women. At the same time, Ralph, you brought up SFFA in the admissions context. We are penalized for being Indians, for being Asians. And so it's this very sort of it's this interesting dichotomy that on the one hand, we're penalized in an admissions context. On the other hand, on campus, if we don't join or sign on to the sort of DEI aggrieved minority framework, we're referred to as white adjacent, or as though, we are minorities, or we're betraying the larger rainbow coalition, to use popular phrase of the Democratic Party. And so that's, there's it is truly hard to be a racial minority and a conservative on college campuses. I'll briefly add from my own experience where I felt uh, pushback the most. I did not become outspoken as a conservative probably until the end of my college career, when I finally couldn't take it anymore. But now husband, we met in college, and he was, from the moment he stepped foot on campus, a very outspoken young conservative, had grown up working on Republican campaigns all across New York and Long Island. And when we started
Yeah.
dating, there was so much pushback, shockingly, from other women as to why where I had not yet, quote unquote, come out as a conservative myself, would be comfortable dating a white Republican man. So there was a lot of animosity thrown my way simply over the fact that I decided to date someone who was of a different skin color and different political persuasion than me. Um, and so, yeah, I'm sure you two both must also feel that being a racial minority and a conservative, a Republican, it's quite difficult.
Yeah.
Renu, you were just choosing your oppression, right?
I am, exactly, 100%.
Like I identify with so much of what you say. Going back to when I was looking at different colleges and kind of figuring out what were the places that would be reach schools, what would be the places that I would most likely get into. I remember my parents sat me down and they wanted me to go to the best college that they could send me to, but there was always a reality. They told me, your grades are good enough for an Asian, or sorry, they're good, they're just not good enough for an Asian.
Hmm.
I had some stats that I thought would make me stand out in the admissions process. I think some of you know this, but I don't know if our listeners do, but I competed at the National Spelling Bee for 4 years. I made it into the top 10 my final 2 years, and this was when I was in middle school. I also did pageants, which is actually where I developed my interest in public affairs. I feel like I've lived kind of a lot of life, and um, I just thought that maybe those stats would stand out in admissions, and I know it did because I remember my first week at Cornell during orientation week. The dean of our college was giving some stats on our class. So, what were the unique qualities among our peers? There was someone who was collecting bugs around the world, and then they mentioned my spelling bee stat.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, and like this was a college. I think we had 2 or 3,000 students just in that college. So I'm like, okay, so clearly out of 40,000 applications, that stood out. But I was waitlisted to Cornell, and I think in the back of my head there was always just this idea that, and when you're waitlisted or when you're not getting in, you feel like you're second best. You weren't good enough to get in, and I realized years later that that was just not true. I remember sitting in an education class, and there was a student who was bragging about getting into Cornell with a 3.4 GPA. And that's not the typical GPA you get accepted into to Cornell. And it's not like this person had any amazing sports accomplishments or like anything that I could find on the internet. So that was when I realized that there are decisions that are being made that have nothing to do with merit or accomplishments. But for a long time, I had that insecurity. And when you're hearing from a parent that you might be good enough, you've clearly have some accomplishments, but it's just not good enough for an Asian. Like that's just what I remember sticking with me for a long time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly can identify with, the idea that, I wasn't good enough in part because I actually wasn't for time, right? I was not a good high school student. I had a mediocre SAT score in part because I didn't study and showed up 15 minutes late for the SAT when I took it. Um, Oh, but I also didn't apply to college, right? I mean, I had no intention of going to college as a high school student. My plan was to join the military and then, become a cop or a fireman and, do that for a living. It wasn't until I started getting recruited to play baseball in college that, I even considered higher education. I'm so glad that I did. And that opened up so many doors, and I eventually kind of found my way. But to me, I mean, the one thing that kind of made me that allowed me to sort of grapple with the insecurities that I think I went into college with was that once I discovered that there was this whole other, world of intellectual thought that none of my professors even bothered engaging with clearly, it just made them seem way less impressive. It demystified the entire aura of, from high on that they held. And I just remember this kind of paradigm shift in my own head where it's like I went into, my classrooms and I carried that with me into law school with this just like, well, how special could these people really be if they, if they haven't even, explored or won't aren't even willing to grapple with some of these other ideas, and that was a big thing for me. But Rainey, you mentioned something earlier that I want to get back to you because you said you weren't an outspoken conservative until your later part of your undergraduate tenure, and that suggests that there was a time in which you were conservative but not outspoken. And I hear so much from young people about the degree to which they self-censor on college campuses. They just don't feel comfortable outing themselves. They feel like when they're taking written exams or writing essays, they have to kind of give the standard progressive argument that's most obvious, lest they be graded in a way that is unfair. And one of the things that the City Journal College Rankings looks at is this self-censorship component. And so what was that like for you? I mean, was it a conscious choice? Was it, a sort of you were still kind of developing your views and so maybe weren't confident being outspoken, or was it like this sort of social pressure to just keep your mouth shut on certain things?
I think it was definitely the social pressure, and I think part of that was I think, out of my, sort of large group of close female friends in college, Holy Cross is an extremely small liberal arts school in Massachusetts, and the way the housing process works, you're sort of grouped with a group of either young men or young women your first year there, and then you sort of go through college with them, and so all the girls that were on my first year all ended up being my large group of friends, and every single one was extremely progressive except for one, and I was just, terrified that if I shared my beliefs as, a quote brown woman on this, liberal arts Catholic campus that, does not align with any of that, I would be ostracized socially. I did not necessarily feel it as much in terms of my coursework, largely being because I had this one professor that was a mentor, is now a good friend of mine. Him and his wife both still teach at Holy Cross. They're now mentoring my younger sister who's a senior there, so that's been wonderful. And so I didn't
Yeah.
necessarily feel that in terms of academics, but socially, very much so, and I'd say, like I said, I arrived on campus very progressive, but very ignorant. I was progressive because that's all I had been exposed to, but I hadn't been forced to think about any of these issues. Only in, reading, like Machiavelli and Clarence Thomas and all of that was I exposed to a different way of thinking in which I thought, "Oh, okay, like, I actually think that Scalia's dissent is correct, and, like, Ginsburg's majority opinion is really silly." So that happened over the course of my freshman year, but I was just so terrified that I would be ostracized by the women around me and would have no friends that I sort of kept my views internalized. It wasn't until my junior year when I went abroad, just a whole separate experience. that, I really couldn't take it anymore. And I thought, you know what, at this point, I have my close friends. They want to stay my friends. That's fine. Who cares? But yeah, it was definitely social pressure. I think, particularly being a young woman and not holding the stereotypical sort of like feminist beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I went to undergraduate school here at the University, a State University in New York. So between the fact that I was playing baseball and had my teammates, and that I was still close to home, and so still had my high school friends, my social circle didn't feel like it was going to take a hit, which I think is part of why I, didn't feel uncomfortable being outspoken. And then, by the time I got to law school, I had already met and was with my now wife, then fiance. So, you know, again, I wasn't really worried too much about social pressure, but there are a lot of people who are, and Neeta, I'm curious as to your experience because, Cornell is one of those institutions. I mean, I think about Thomas Sowell, right, who taught there for a time and has written,
Yeah.
the degree to which he was just pulling his hair out about the lack of sort of ideological pluralism on that campus. And so I can't imagine that it was easy for you, but I'm just curious to hear about what that experience was like.
No, it wasn't easy for me. And I attended 2014 to 2018. So I was there to see the aftermath of the 2016 election. And I remember the day after, there are people, they were having cry-ins. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's
I've
where
heard of it.
people sit in a circle on campus and they cry and they had their hot chocolate. And I think there might have been a puppy. I did consider going only to get the free hot chocolate, but there were cry-ins, there were protests. And I think what was most ostracizing about that whole experience was you knew that that was not going to be the reaction. That space would not have been given to conservative students
Right.
if the
Hillary.
results had gone the other way.
Right.
And so you're seeing a lot of people crying on campus, and you kind of like it's like you couldn't even celebrate if you were happy that your candidate won, or even just like, I don't know, have a normal day.
Mhm.
And it felt like a lot of classes, people were just sharing their perspectives on the election, but you knew that it would not be reciprocated if you had a different view.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that you talk about cry-ins because it brings to mind a moment where it all kind of crystallized for me, which is frankly later than it should have. My attitude as a student toward my progressive classmates was generally a suspicious one. I didn't it just never felt authentic to me in a lot of ways. It felt like they were kind of sticking to a script, that a lot of it was performative, but they never struck me as really true believers. It really wasn't until 2014, which was my second year of law school, when there was or it might have been it was my third year of law school, when there was that whole thing at Yale, with Nicholas Christakis.
That was 2015.
Was it 2015?
Yes, it's Halloween. It's the Halloween
Yeah,
incident,
Halloween. Yeah.
right?
So it might have been even after law school, but there was this moment where like he's in this courtyard, right? And he's getting screamed at by this group of students. And one of these women, a young Black woman, breaks down. I mean, you can see that she cannot control her emotions. Um, and that was when it hit me that, oh no, this is actually sincere, which makes it significantly scarier, as someone who cares about the state of these institutions and their future. Because if what everyone's doing is kind of silently playing a game, right? Where we all just kind of accept that we're going to say these things, but no one's particularly motivated at a deep level to sort of keep the charade up once they leave. That's a very different story than like, hey, these institutions are actually trying to affect meaningful change over a long period of time and steer generations toward a completely different worldview, one which, frankly, in my opinion, is just completely incompatible with what the United States stands for. And that was, a moment for me where I really started to care and pay attention about this a lot more than I had prior to that point. Um, but yeah, I mean, did it seem that way to you? I mean, or was the sort of the reality in your view that, these feelings were sincerely held?
Yeah, I like that you bring up the word performative with a lot of these issues that people seem to support because there's kind of this mob mentality where people just support the issues because they were told to, or it makes them feel righteous or good, and they can start hitting everyone else over the head with a hammer and shame them if they don't fall in line. And it just always struck me as weird because I think just because you go around saying that you're a good person doesn't mean you are a good person. And
Exactly.
I just didn't like the shaming, the sort of scolding attitude that they had, on these issues and sort of just get in line, my way or the highway approach. So, yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I saw that, this this kind of inspired the first opinion piece I'd ever written, which was super scary for me at the time because as I mentioned earlier, I had not really engaged in political discussions. And the first piece I ever wrote, it was around this time of year actually since it's Halloween, and everyone would go around saying, "My culture," or, what is it? My culture is not your costume," and people would go around like, there were these posters where it's like, "Don't wear a bindi," and for me, I'm like, I want people to engage with my culture. This is what I did in my small town where people were not familiar with my culture. I would share Indian food. I would bring Indian food with me for lunch and I would share it with my friends, people who had never had Indian food before. And so I like to say that I was making Indian food trendy before it was trendy. And it was a way for people to engage with my culture, to ask questions freely and a way for them to engage with it. And what I was noticing was that the attitude, the discussion around culture appropriation was making it harder for people to approach me and to have honest conversations, talking about India or talking about my culture. And so I wrote my first piece, and the idea was that instead of cultural appropriation, let's see it as cultural appreciation, that cultures are shared and that we engage with it. And I felt very strongly writing that piece because I just felt like a lot of people who weren't from my culture were getting offended on my behalf. They were speaking on my behalf. And they had not considered the other side of that story, that maybe engaging in the culture, a lot of people who are engaging with it, they're wearing a bindi, they're eating Indian food. They're not trying to be offensive. They're trying to engage with a culture that's different from what they're used to.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, this kind of paternalistic approach that's actually counterproductive to what we want if we're honest when we say that we want everyone to live together in harmony, right? I mean, that requires some openness and some grace. I mean, and here's where I kind of, sort of count myself lucky because I never grew up with those sensitivities, in part because I always lived in really diverse places, right? I mean, like I grew up the first part of my childhood in Brooklyn, where everyone that I went to school with and hung out with was either black or Puerto Rican. But then moving to Long Island, some of my friends in high school were Indian, some of them were East Asian, some of them were Hispanic, some of them were like Caribbean blacks, West African black, white. Then I played baseball, right? So athletics was kind of a great experience for me for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is it exposed me to a lot of different people in an environment where we were all sort of coming together for a common goal, which kind of, you know, uh, um, subordinated whatever differences we had to the commonality, which was our love for baseball and our sort of pursuit of a championship and that sort of thing. Actually, I got to go down to the Dominican Republic for a Philadelphia Phillies sort of combine thing when I was a senior in high school. And one of the other guys that was down there, we kind of shuttled from the airport. And he comes off from his gate, and he's got like a Confederate flag belt buckle. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, oh my goodness, like this is going to be terrible. And he ended up being my favorite guy in that whole group. Sal, was came off the plane with a dip in his mouth and a big Confederate flag on his belt, and it was. I mean, he was a hilarious guy. There was no ill will. I mean, I remember our first game together. I walked in my first at bat, and I stole second base. I ended up scoring on a base hit when I got back into the dugout. He was like, "I knew one of you brown guys was going to steal something eventually." I mean, it was just like this hilarious, kind of very loose environment, and being on baseball teams through college. I mean, I got to have so much fun. I mean, like we had, there were a lot of Dominican players at the colleges that I played at, and so we would take some of our white team, Dominican house parties, and they would have a blast, and we'd teach them how to dance merengue and bachata, and it was a good time, but no one was overly sensitive. No one was sort of taking this like weird sense of exclusionary ownership over an identity. It was, and it was much more productive and much more conducive to the building of positive relationships. And that's the kind of, approach to diversity that I wish we took. But it seems like, I mean, universities have by and large bought into this idea of diversity that's, the complete opposite of that.
It's superficial. Like they focus on how diverse your communities look, but they don't consider the diversity of thoughts. And that's why I think they don't actually have true diversity.
And it's like, and you look is exactly the right word there, right? Because it's like how diverse your communities look. But the second I opened my mouth and talked about what I believed, I was no longer part of that community, right? Like,
Yeah,
You're
same
white
thing.
adjacent.
no
You're
longer
white
matter,
adjacent.
right? It's like, this is diversity if what we're doing is taking a picture for the brochure, right? But we don't actually have any interest in real diversity and the things that make us distinct from one another. And that always came through in every sort of experience that I had with the official institutions that I was educated at. And I think that's a shame because it I think drove people apart way more than it brought them together. And the things that I hear from college students now, and people in graduate school now indicate to me that we have regressed, a quarter century in terms of the progress that we've made on racial grounds.
I think that's largely because if you think about it, the logical extreme, like the extreme conclusion of DEI as practiced today in American higher education of wokeness is in fact immense racism, to be so afraid to wear a bindi or, I remember taking a group of friends in college, all female, to an Indian restaurant in Worcester or Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, right near Worcester, and they said I had to order for the whole table because they were so concerned they would mispronounce,
Goodness.
like
Oh,
like saag paneer or something, and I'm like, it's how it's spelled. It's not like it's okay, and so the logical extreme of these beliefs is immense racism, which is why so many of these very progressive young women had a problem that I was, dating a white conservative. Now, my now husband, thought that was not okay, which, sounds like it's out of, the Jim Crow South to
Yep.
say something like that. Um, so that's just unfortunately the logical extreme of a lot of these ideas that are at the root of higher education today.
It is, and, what I love about the City College, the City Journal College rankings is that they're actually capturing this and giving people a little bit of insight into, what those environments are like in the institutions that they're considering, and it just leads me to ask you guys, I mean, Rainey, you're married. I have two small kids. Neetu, you're married as well, right? So, eventually we're all going to be in a position where we are considering the educational futures of our children. And, you know, I was, kind of stressing about that the last couple of years. I mean, as someone who has to follow this stuff for a living, I just felt, exasperated at the fact that like I couldn't imagine wanting or being excited about paying for my children to be educated at, the median U.S. college or university. But these rankings finally give me a sense that like hey, actually, I have a little bit of guidance where I can sort of point them in the right direction and make them, an informed choice that is not going to force me to, choose between excellence and undermining my values. As a parent, and I wonder if you all sort of feel that same sense of relief from this. I mean, when you're thinking about making this choice, as a family for your future children, um, I think there are a lot of parents who will say, like ours, said, just get into the best college that you possibly can. And by best, we mean, the one with, that's most selective, right? As if that's kind of the only criteria that matters. But do we think there's a future in which um, that's no longer the case, where this other stuff starts to matter just as much, if not more?
I mean, I'd like to see these rankings have an influence on the policies universities adopt. One thing I've always said about Cornell is that I think it was a good investment economically, and that's what our rankings show. But the environment on campus isn't good. And until they change that, I wouldn't be enthusiastic of my future children attending Cornell.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I also think that, Ralph, by the time your kids are old enough to go to college and, Neetu and my future kids are old enough, I really think that just the reputation of these sort of like traditional prestigious universities in the US will be even further eroded. It seems as though every few months the Wall Street Journal has a different magazine feature piece about the rise of SEC schools, for example, not just in terms of popularity amongst students, in simply attending them for being more quintessentially American, having good football teams and actually having tailgates and encouraging Greek life, but also because they seem to be much more focused on educating students, particularly in STEM fields. And so I think, we're already seeing companies put a greater emphasis on, engineering degrees from, say, the University of Georgia or Georgia Tech, as opposed to just, you having some random, I don't know, gender studies degree, but it's from Princeton or Harvard. And so I think by the time that our kids attend, you know, college, if they choose to do so, then at that point, I really don't think that these sort of like legacy schools will have as much of a high standing as they do today. I think there will be, I think one, there will be new legacy schools, hopefully informed by city journals systems, such as the University of Florida already see, I mean, University of Michigan, UT Austin have already, have already for years been considered public Ivies. I think that will continue. Same with like, the University of Chicago, Notre Dame, et cetera. But I also just think companies will care more about, do you have tangible skills that you can offer us as opposed to what's the, name of the university that you attended.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that prediction is going to bear itself out over the next decade, and I think that City Journal's college rankings will play a role in that. Well, as much as I'd love to continue the conversation, I think we are running up against time. So I just want to thank you both once again for outstanding analysis and insights. I want to thank our producer, Isabella Rajai, and I want to thank you all for listening to the City Journal podcast, which I love doing. And so I hope that you enjoy it as much as I enjoy doing it. If you do, please don't forget, like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell, ask us a question, drop us a note, let us know what you think, unless you don't like it, in which case you can just, no, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back with another episode next week. You have been watching the City Journal podcast.